In a children's hospital filled with fear and silence, hope arrived in the most unexpected form. Not a doctor, not a nurse, but a gentle alpaca. What happened next left doctors amazed and parents in tears. This is the incredible true story of Marco, the therapy alpaca who healed children's hearts. There is a kind of silence in children's hospitals that is different from any other place. It's not the absence of noise. Machines beep softly, footsteps echo down sterile corridors, and distant voices murmur in hushed tones. It's the silence of held breaths, of fragile hope, and of young hearts carrying burdens far too heavy for their years. At the Norfolk Children's Hospital in England, winter had settled outside the windows, casting pale gray light across the wards. Inside, rows of beds were lined with small patients, children fighting illnesses that left them exhausted and frightened. Some bore the marks of long battles, tubes and monitors, casts and bandages. Others showed their wounds in quieter ways, in eyes that no longer sparkled, in lips that had forgotten how to smile. Nurses did their best to bring cheer. Bright murals of animals and balloons decorated the walls. Toys and books were scattered across play areas. Volunteers read stories and played soft music to lift the children's spirits. But for many of the young patients, fear clung tightly, especially for those who had been there the longest. 6-year-old Emily had once been the brightest light in her family. She loved singing, skipping, and painting rainbows across every piece of paper she could find. But weeks in a hospital bed had dimmed her colors. The treatments were harsh, the pain unrelenting, and her once lively voice had grown quiet. Her parents sat by her side every day, holding her small hand and whispering words of comfort. But even as they spoke, they watched helplessly as the sparkle faded from their daughter's eyes. "She hasn't smiled in days," her mother confided to a nurse, her voice trembling. The nurse forced a brave smile. "We'll keep trying," she said softly. But in her heart, she wished for something, anything, that could break through the heavy clouds that hung over the ward. Emily was not alone. Across the room, 8-year-old Sam stared blankly at the ceiling, his eyes tracing invisible patterns in the sterile tiles. 2 weeks earlier, he had undergone surgery to remove a tumor from his leg. The procedure had been successful, but the emotional toll had been immense. Since waking from the operation, he had barely spoken a word. Doctors and therapists visited daily, coaxing him gently to engage, but Sam retreated further into himself, hiding behind a wall of quiet despair. Outside the hospital, the world carried on with its ordinary rhythms, but inside, time seemed frozen, a limbo of waiting rooms and whispered hopes. Then, one cold morning, something unusual happened. It began with a murmur of curiosity among the nurses, then spread like a spark down the corridors. Emily, half asleep beneath her blankets, heard the shuffle of unfamiliar footsteps and the sound of cheerful voices growing nearer. Curiosity flickered weakly in her chest. She lifted her head, just enough to see nurses smiling. Truly smiling, for the first time in days. And then, around the corner, appeared the strangest and most wonderful sight. A fluffy alpaca, golden brown and snow white, ambled gently into the ward. His name was Marco. His eyes were large and kind, fringed by long lashes that made him look almost like a storybook character come to life. His handlers walked beside him, guiding him softly. But Marco seemed perfectly at ease, as if he had strolled hospital corridors every day of his life. Gasps of amazement filled the air. Children sat up in their beds, their tired faces lighting with curiosity. Even Sam, from across the room, shifted slightly, his gaze sharpening as he took in the sight of the peculiar visitor. Emily's eyes widened. Camel?" she whispered hoarsely. Her mother laughed through her tears. "No, darling, that's an alpaca." Emily blinked at Marco, who came to a gentle stop beside her bed. For a moment, child and animal simply stared at one another, as if measuring the distance between fear and wonder. Then Marco lowered his neck gracefully, bringing his soft nose close to her hand. Without thinking, Emily reached out. Her fingers brushed the warm, velvety fur of his cheek. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she smiled. The transformation was instant and electric. The room, once filled with quiet sorrow, came alive with energy. Children laughed, pointed, and clapped as Marco moved from bed to bed, pausing at each child's side with gentle patience. He nuzzled hands, accepted cautious pats on his thick coat, and stood calmly while wide-eyed children hugged him tightly. Sam's mother, seated beside his bed, felt her heart leap as she saw her son lean forward ever so slightly. His lips parted, as if to speak, but no sound came. Still, it was more than she had seen in days. Marco turned toward Sam, his gaze soft and knowing. With careful steps, the alpaca moved closer, stopping just inches from the boy's bedside. Sam's eyes locked onto Marco's. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he reached out a trembling hand. Marco met him halfway. As Sam's fingers sank into the alpaca's thick fleece, a flicker of life returned to his expression. His lips formed a single, whispered word. "Soft." His mother gasped, tears welling in her eyes. The nurse beside her pressed a hand to her heart. Hope, long buried beneath layers of fear, blossomed anew. As Marco continued his rounds, the entire ward seemed to transform. Nurses laughed along with the children, their usual clinical detachment replaced by genuine joy. Doctors paused their rounds to watch, astonished by the visible changes in their young patients. Parents, some of whom had not seen their children smile in weeks, wept openly as they witnessed the simple magic unfolding before them. Marco's handlers explained that the alpaca had been trained not just for obedience, but for connection. "He senses emotions," one of them said softly. "He knows who needs him the most." Looking around the room, it was clear they spoke the truth. Marco lingered longest at the bedsides of the most withdrawn children, resting his head on their laps, or pressing his soft cheek to their hands. It was as if he carried with him a gentle message. You are not alone. For Emily, the morning with Marco felt like waking from a long, heavy sleep. She giggled as Marco tickled her hand with his soft muzzle, and for the first time since her diagnosis, she asked her mother for her crayons. With shaking fingers, she drew a picture of the alpaca, filling the page with bright yellows and soft browns. "I want to give it to him," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. Her mother's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled through them. "I think he'd love that." Outside, the winter chill still clung to the air, but inside the hospital, warmth had returned. Not from heaters or blankets, but from the spark of life that Marco had kindled in every child he touched. As he completed his visit and turned to leave the ward, a spontaneous chorus of tiny voices rose behind him. "Bye, Marco. Come back soon." "Thank you, Marco." The alpaca paused at the door. He turned his head, as if to offer a final farewell, and with a soft, knowing blink, he continued on his way. The children watched him go, their hearts lighter, their spirits lifted. And in that moment, the walls of the hospital no longer felt so cold. They felt alive, full of hope. The days following Marco's first visit felt different inside the hospital walls. The corridors, once filled with quiet anxiety, now hummed with a quiet undercurrent of excitement. Children who had once watched the clock for visiting hours now asked, almost daily, the same hopeful question. Is Marco coming today? Even the nurses began to smile more freely, catching glimpses of colored drawings taped proudly beside hospital beds, almost all of them featuring the now famous Alpaca. Crayon sketches of Marco decorated the windows, walls, and even the nurses' station. Children depicted him with bright, joyful colors, adding playful details like crowns of flowers, superhero capes, or hearts floating above his head. Marco had become more than a visitor. He had become a symbol of hope. For Emily, Marco's return felt like a dream she didn't want to wake from. She had kept the drawing she made for him, folding and unfolding it so many times that the edges were soft and worn. When she saw him step into the ward again, his warm eyes scanning the room as if looking for familiar faces, her heart leapt with pure joy. "Marco!" she cried, her voice strong and clear. Her mother, startled by the strength in Emily's tone, felt tears sting her eyes once again. Marco approached Emily's bed, and she eagerly held out her drawing. "It's for you," she said. Marco's handler took the picture with a gentle smile and tucked it into a pouch hanging by his side. "He'll keep it safe," the handler promised. Emily beamed, and for the first time in weeks, her laughter rang through the ward like sunlight breaking through clouds. Across the room, Sam's transformation was equally profound. The boy who had once withdrawn into silence now sat upright in his bed, his eyes bright with anticipation. When Marco reached his bedside, Sam surprised everyone, even himself, by speaking in a clear, determined voice. "Hi, Marco," he said. "I missed you." Marco lowered his head, as if acknowledging the boy's words, and nudged Sam's outstretched hand with his soft nose. The moment was simple, but it rippled through the hearts of everyone watching. It was more than progress. It was healing. Marco's visits soon became a cherished ritual. Every week, he arrived at the hospital with his handlers, and each time, the children's faces lit up with joy. They learned Marco's favorite snacks and took turns feeding him carefully sliced apples and carrots. They brushed his thick, woolly coat and laughed as he flicked his ears playfully. For the children confined to their beds, Marco came close and rested his head gently on the edge of their mattresses, offering the comfort of his warm presence. Doctors observed, quietly amazed, as children began to respond not just emotionally, but physically. Patients who had been reluctant to move were now sitting up, reaching out, engaging with the world around them. Parents, once filled with worry, saw flickers of their children's old selves returning. "He brings them back to life," one mother whispered to a nurse. The nurse nodded, her own eyes glistening. "He brings life into this whole place." Word of Marco's impact spread beyond the hospital walls. Local news outlets ran stories featuring photos of the alpaca, standing proudly beside smiling children. Headlines read, "Hope on 4 hooves, how an alpaca is healing young hearts. Therapy, alpaca brings joy to hospitalized children." The community rallied around the hospital, donating supplies for the children and even crafting small toys shaped like alpacas. One local artist created a plush version of Marco, complete with his fluffy fur and kind expression, which became the most requested comfort toy in the ward. Marco had become a hero, not for grand, world-changing feats, but for the quiet, powerful way he touched each child's life. Then, one sunny spring afternoon, the hospital staff and Marco's handlers planned something special, a celebration, a day just for the children and their beloved alpaca. The hospital courtyard, usually reserved for quiet moments of fresh air, was transformed into a festival of color and joy. Balloons bobbed in the breeze, streamers danced in the sunlight, and a banner hung proudly over the entrance. "Thank you, Marco, our hero with hooves." The children, many of them bundled in blankets and escorted by nurses or parents, gathered eagerly in the courtyard. Some were wheeled out in hospital beds, others sat in chairs, their eyes wide with anticipation. And when Marco trotted into the courtyard, his coat brushed to a shine, adorned with a garland of wildflowers around his neck, the children erupted into cheers. "Marco! We love you, Marco!" Even the doctors and nurses clapped, their professional reserve momentarily set aside in favor of pure celebration. Marco's handlers guided him through the crowd, but it was clear that he needed no direction. He moved instinctively from child to child, pausing to accept pets and hugs, his soft eyes filled with quiet affection. One little boy, who had been too weak to attend Marco's previous visits, reached out from his wheelchair with trembling fingers. Marco stepped close, lowering his head so the boy could bury his hand in the alpaca's thick fleece. The boy's mother wept softly, overwhelmed by the tenderness of the moment. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the celebration continued. Children sang songs they had written for Marco, their young voices full of joy. They presented him with handmade crowns of paper and fabric, which Marco wore proudly. One nurse, fighting back tears, whispered to a colleague, "It's like he knows he's their hero." And in a way, he did. Marco's calm, intuitive presence had brought light to a place shadowed by illness and fear. He had reminded everyone, children, parents, and staff alike, that even in the darkest times, there is still room for joy, for connection, and for hope. As the day drew to a close, the children gathered for one final gesture. With the help of nurses and parents, they had created a giant thank you card, filled with drawings, messages of love, and tiny handprints pressed into bright paint. They presented it to Marco's handlers, who promised to hang it in Marco's home stable, where he could see it every day. Before he left, Marco took one more slow walk around the courtyard, pausing to nuzzle each child as if to say goodbye. When he reached Emily, she held up a small bouquet of wildflowers, her hands steady and strong. "For you," she said softly. Marco bent his head, accepting the gift with gentle grace. Then, with a final blink of his long lashes, he turned and trotted away, his handlers leading him toward the gate. The children waved until he disappeared from sight. Back in the ward, as the children returned to their beds and parents settled beside them, a new feeling filled the air. It wasn't just the joy of the day's celebration. It was something deeper. A quiet certainty that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, they were stronger together. And that somewhere, not far away, their four-legged friend Marco carried with him the love and gratitude of every child he had touched. Time moved forward, as it always does. Seasons changed outside the walls of Norfolk Children's Hospital, painting the world in fresh colors. Spring's green, summer's gold, autumn's fire, and winter's quiet white. Inside the hospital, life continued its steady rhythm of treatments, procedures, and quiet courage. But something had changed. Since Marco had first walked into the hospital, he had become more than just a visitor. He was woven into the very fabric of the hospital's story, his hoofprints pressed not into the floors, but into the hearts of every child who met him. For Emily, those visits had been life-changing. Her recovery was slow, but steady. Each time Marco entered her room, her strength seemed to grow. She pushed herself to sit up taller, to smile brighter, to share stories about the day she would finally run outside and meet Marco not in a hospital ward, but in the open air beneath a blue sky. And then, one morning, that dream came true. With her doctors cheering her on and her parents' arms waiting, Emily took her final steps out of the hospital doors. But she didn't leave empty-handed. In her arms, she carried a soft plush version of Marco, a gift from the hospital staff, along with a scrapbook filled with photos of their time together. As she crossed the threshold, Emily paused, looking back one last time. "Thank you, Marco," she whispered. Somewhere down the corridor, as if he heard her, Marco raised his head from his stall and let out a soft, gentle hum. Emily wasn't the only one. Child after child, each facing battles far too great for their small bodies, found strength in Marco's presence. Sam, the boy who had once barely spoken, made remarkable progress. By the time of his discharge, he was not only walking confidently, but also helping the hospital staff care for younger children, sharing stories about Marco and comforting them during difficult moments. Before he left, Sam drew one final picture. Marco, standing tall beneath a bright sun, surrounded by children and flowers. He signed it carefully at the bottom and taped it to the wall of the playroom, where new patients could see it every day. "Marco helps you heal," he wrote in neat block letters. "Trust him." As children left the hospital, new faces arrived, some fearful, some uncertain, all carrying the heavy weight of illness. But thanks to the legacy Marco had built, they were never alone in their fight. The first thing many of them saw in the ward was the colorful mural of Marco, painted proudly across an entire wall. He stood there, bright and welcoming, a crown of flowers on his head, surrounded by the smiling faces of children who had once shared the same beds. Nurses would point to the mural and tell new patients, "Marco is our special friend. He'll be visiting you soon." And just like that, hope would flicker in their eyes. Marco's visits continued, each one as magical as the first. No matter how many times he walked the familiar corridors, he never lost the gentle patience that made him so beloved. He seemed to understand that every child needed something different. For some, it was the comfort of stroking his soft fur. For others, it was simply knowing that Marco was there, a quiet, steady presence in the midst of fear and uncertainty. He never rushed. He never turned away. And in his way, he taught the children something profound, that healing is not only in the medicine we take, but in the moments of connection we share. The hospital staff, deeply moved by Marco's impact, decided to honor him in a special way. On the anniversary of his first visit, they organized a ceremony in the courtyard. Children, parents, doctors, and nurses gathered beneath colorful streamers and bright balloons. A local artist unveiled a bronze statue of Marco, crafted with loving detail, capturing his wise eyes and gentle posture perfectly. At the base of the statue, an inscription read, "Marco the Alpaca, healed hearts one step at a time." Tears welled in the eyes of many as they remembered the moments Marco had brought life and laughter back into the hospital. The children, some now healthy and strong, placed wreaths of flowers around the statue's neck. "Thank you, Marco," they said together. "Thank you." For Marco, there were no words, no speeches, only the simple joy of doing what he had always done, bringing comfort wherever he stepped. As the crowd applauded, he stood beside the statue, lifting his head high as if to acknowledge the honor. Then, true to his gentle nature, he turned and ambled over to a small child sitting quietly at the edge of the gathering. The child's eyes lit up as Marco approached. He reached out with a tiny, trembling hand and Marco lowered his head to meet it. Another heart, touched. Another spark of hope ignited. The crowd watched in awe, their hearts full. As years passed, Marco grew older, his once springy steps becoming a bit slower, his coat touched with hints of silver. But age never dimmed his spirit. He continued his visits to the hospital, welcomed each time as a hero, a friend, a healer. New children met him with wide-eyed wonder, parents with grateful tears, and staff with deep respect. Marco had become a legend in his own lifetime, not because of grand gestures, but because of countless small acts of kindness. And as his story spread beyond the hospital, he inspired people far and wide. Schools shared his story in lessons about empathy and compassion. Artists painted him as a symbol of gentle strength. Families facing difficult times found comfort in knowing that, somewhere in Norfolk, a humble alpaca was teaching the world about the power of quiet, steadfast love. One crisp spring morning, as Marco made his way through the familiar courtyard, he paused beneath the cherry blossoms in bloom. Children waved from the windows, calling out his name with joy. He stood for a moment, breathing in the fresh air, surrounded by the echoes of laughter and love. And then, with slow, steady steps, he continued on his path, as he always had, as he always would. Because heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear soft wool, walk on gentle hooves, and carry hope in every step.